Hello, my name is Markus Pantsar. I'm from the University of Helsinki, and my topic today will be the cognitive complexity and mathematical problem solving. But before I begin, I need to clarify one issue. So, I will be mostly talking about computational modeling of human cognitive tasks, but this doesn't mean that I'm a particular proponent of the computational model of mind. I think the approach here is more general than that. I'm just asking how, from a computational perspective, we might be able to model the cognitive task of mathematical problem solving. Okay, I need to take my face out of the picture so that all the slides will show. We'll begin from David Marr's distinction between three levels of explanation in cognitive science. It's a very widely used distinction, which is still sort of the go-to distinction in philosophy when it comes to computational modeling. So first there's the computational level, which means what the cognitive task is functionally speaking, that is in terms of its input and output purely. Then there's the second level, which is the algorithmic level, which means the level where we study how the task is performed. That is how the output is calculated for each input. And then there's the third level, which is the level of implementation, meaning how the algorithm is implemented on the physical level. And usually this would mean the neuronal level in the brain. And famously, Marr argued that for maximal progress in cognitive science, the focus should be on the level 1. So the computational level should be our main focus when we try to explain cognitive phenomena. So, what does this mean when it comes to the particular question of mathematical problem solving? Well, in the computational approach, as defined, we are not interested in the actual algorithms that are used in computing the values of a function, nor are we interested in the neuronal processes that are carried out. So what is left is identifying a function that models solving the mathematical problem. But when we frame this function as a decision problem, meaning a problem with only the options yes and no as answers, a mathematical problem is in fact such a function. So it is understandable that the complexity of a problem and the complexity of the cognitive task of solving the problem are identified because both can be framed as a decision problem. How this is usually done, how computational complexity is usually studied is of course in terms of Turing machines. So the focus is not on actual problem solving computers. This is a practical pursuit that is very active right now, but in this theoretical approach we focus on this theoretical model that is the universal Turing machine. And by that machine model, we can study the computational complexity of mathematical problems in a way that is not restricted by any constraints on memory or computational speed of a computer. And under this approach, we measure the complexity of a problem in terms of the complexity of the optimal strategy for solving it. This means the complexity of the least complex Turing machine that solves the problem. Well, what does optimal strategy mean? There are basically two standard measures for complexity when it comes to decision problems. It can be measured with time and it can be measured with space. It of course needs to be remembered here that the Turing machine is an abstract model, so time and space are not measured in seconds or bits. What they are measured in is as functions of the size of the input. And this has proven to be a very fruitful approach. And one of the main results of this approach is that we can divide computational problems into so-called complexity classes. The lowest of these complexity classes is called P, and it's defined as the class of decision problems that can be solved by a deterministic Turing machine in polynomial time. An algorithm, and here Turing machine and algorithm mean the same thing, is set to run for polynomial time if its running time has an upper bound of a polynomial function of the size of the input for the algorithm. What this means is that if the size of the input is n, the running time has an upper bound of some function n to the power of k for some constant k. Another important complexity class is called exp or exp time, and it is defined as the class of decision problems that are solvable by a deterministic Turing machine, but now in exponential time. And an algorithm is set to run for exponential time if its running time has a lower bound of some exponential function of the size of the input. So for the size of the input n, the running time has a lower bound of some function to the power of p of n, where p of n is some polynomial function of n. P and exp form an important pair of complexity classes for two particular reasons. First, according to the very widely accepted Cobham's thesis or Cobham-Edmonds thesis, P is the class of problems that can be feasibly solved by a computer. Second, it's been proven that the complexity class exp is strictly greater than P. There's the famous case of NP, of course, and it is not known whether the problem solvable by a non-deterministic Turing machine in polynomial time is strictly greater than P, although we do generally conjecture that P does not equal NP. Now, algorithms for solving problems in P are called efficient or tractable. Algorithms for solving problems in exp, meaning the exp complete problems, which means that the problems are in exp but they are not in P, those algorithms are called inefficient or intractable. And standardly also algorithms for solving problems also in NP are considered to be intractable. So for example, multiplying integers, which takes roughly n squared steps of computation for two n-digit integers with the standard algorithm, is considered to be efficient. Whereas the operation of factoring integers into primes is a good example of an inefficient algorithm. An n-digit integer takes about 2 to the power of the cubic root of n computational steps. Following this paradigm from computer science, there is a strong argument that computational models of cognitive tasks should be limited to tractable functions. In the literature, this is called the tractable cognition thesis. And usually, this thesis is understood as the so-called P-cognition thesis, which is based on the conjecture that the complexity class P defines tractable algorithms. So clearly, the tractable cognition thesis is a strong claim in both cognitive science and philosophy because it imposes theoretical limits on human cognitive capacities. Because as a consequence of accepting the P-cognition thesis, mathematical problems with complexity greater than P would be unsolvable for human beings. I agree with this approach. I agree that some form of the tractable cognition thesis should be accepted, simply based on the physiological limits of our cognitive capacities. But even when we do that, the limits that this imposes leaves us with a huge class of possible functions that could model cognitive tasks computationally. So if we accept the P-cognition thesis, for example, we are left with all functions computable in polynomial time. But this is not necessarily a very good measure of tractability, because finding the greatest common divisor, this problem in its decision form is in P, but solving it takes a great amount of time without parallel processing, and we don't really know of a good way to parallelize the computation. So it would seem that the algorithm for solving the problem of greatest common divisor by the usual Euclidean algorithm is unlikely to be feasible as a model of human cognitive capacities. So in this way, it's clear that not all mathematical problems in P should be considered to be the same in terms of complexity. Even if a problem is solvable in polynomial time, it could be in practice beyond the human capacity to solve it. Based on this consideration, I think that when we study the complexity of mathematical problem solving, we should mostly be interested in the problems whose complexity is within P. Furthermore, A problem can be solvable by human cognitive capacity, but the algorithms that we use may be different from the optimal one, which is the algorithm studied in the computational approach. And both the optimal one and the what I call humanly optimal algorithm can be in P, yet the latter could be more complex than the former. Of course, the opposite cannot be the case because the optimal algorithm is by definition the least complex algorithm for solving a problem. Let me just mention one example here, because in solving mathematical problems, humans generally use diagrams as extended cognitive tools. The diagram obviously can be cognitively beneficial, yet in terms of the computational approach, it merely makes the algorithm needlessly complex. When you think about the use of diagrams, you use a parallel process of drawing a diagram, then making conclusions about the diagram, but if you are solving a mathematical problems in an exact manner, which is the kind of solution we are talking about here, you need to go back to the formal proof which you need to carry out step by step. So everything you do with the diagram adds to the complexity of your cognitive process, and it makes the algorithm that you use less and less optimal from the purely computational approach. What is important here is that many such heuristic processes like drawing diagrams can be optimal. They can even be perhaps indispensable for humans. So we arrive at an important conclusion. We cannot equate the complexity of a mathematical problem with the complexity of the optimal human algorithm for solving it. And as a direct consequence of this conclusion, the complexity of the cognitive task of solving a mathematical problem is not necessarily the same as the complexity of the optimal computational algorithm for solving it. But this goes against the Marian approach of taking the purely computational stand to this question. Because if you take the purely computational approach to human mathematical problem solving, we do equate the complexity of a mathematical problem with the complexity of the cognitive task of solving the problem. Thus, in the Marian free-level distinction between explanations in cognitive science, it seems clear that at least some cognitive tasks are not best characterized purely in terms of the computational approach. But this is not all, because if we expand the paradigm to considerations about the actual algorithms that human beings use when they solve mathematical problems, the whole distinction between the computational and algorithmic levels becomes quite problematic. Of course, it's the case that we can, in principle, determine purely computationally the complexity of the human algorithms, the algorithms that we generally use in cognitive tasks like mathematical problem solving. But if the algorithms that we use are not necessarily the optimal ones, we should already include considerations on this algorithmic level and perhaps even considerations concerning their implementations in the initial research question. As it happens, this is quite a popular approach in actual computational modeling that scientists are doing. So Sun, for example, has argued that the distinction between Mars tree levels is relatively insignificant in actual computational modeling of human cognitive capacities. I quote, "One cannot specify algorithms without at least some considerations of possible implementations, and what is to be considered computation relies on algorithms, especially the notion of algorithmic complexity and so on. Therefore, one often has to consider computation, algorithms, and implementation together somehow, especially in relation to cognition." So, what have we achieved here? Well, we have seen that the computational approach to cognitive tasks can be highly beneficial. I'm not questioning that. It greatly limits the space of function that can feasibly work as models of cognitive processes. So if we accept the p-cognition thesis, for example, we get the complexity class exp, or perhaps also the complexity class np, which show us this huge class of functions which are not feasible as models of cognitive process. That's an important result. However, I don't think this is all we can do when we study cognitive tasks in terms of their complexity. Because within P, we can make great distinctions between complexities of different cognitive tasks, of different algorithms. So the tractable, intractable distinction should not be considered to be all there is to the approach from complexity to explaining cognitive tasks. We have also seen that in mathematical problem solving, we cannot equate the complexity of a problem with the complexity of the cognitive task of solving it. Human beings often use computationally unoptimal tools such as diagrams and other heuristic tools, which only add to the complexity of the algorithm, but they might be highly important, even indispensable, for our cognitive capacities in order to solve the mathematical problem. So we end up with the conclusion that we should also include elements from Mars algorithmic level in our explanations of the cognitive complexity of mathematical problem solving. So in this way, I question Mars' focus on the first level, the computational level. We should consider the other levels as well, especially the algorithmic level. But then there's a very good question based on the quotation from Sun above. For example, should we use this three-level distinction at all? Maybe it is not the most fruitful paradigm to study cognitive complexity, to study the computation modeling of cognitive tasks. So, thank you for listening, and thank you, Stephen, for sending some questions which I'll be answering now. And now there's also enough space on the screen for my face. First question, can you explain how you can distinguish between a computationally optimal or unoptimal tool? Well, as I mentioned, this is done either in terms of time or space that is required for running an algorithm. But we could also use something else, a measure like computational steps or informational complexity, like Kolmogorov complexity. But in any way, computational optimal means the least complex of these algorithms by any of these measures. So, for example, in terms of time, the algorithm that solves a problem, but it takes the least time, that's the optimal one, and all the others are unoptimal. And we can rank the algorithms based on their complexity, based on this measure of time. Second question, do you think that Mars distinction is still relevant nowadays? Do you think it's a coherent distinction? If not, can you detail a bit more why do you think not? Well, I think it is relevant. It's relevant as a theoretical framework. So, for example, my own paper here, it greatly benefits from having this theoretical framework because the distinction between the computational level and algorithmic level is something that I use here to illuminate the problem-solving capacities that we have. So I think it's a coherent distinction, definitely. What it might not be is relevant in terms of actual computational modeling. As was seen in the quotation from Sun, it seems that most people who are working in this field do not really consider Mars distinction to be such an important one anymore. Third question, how can you evaluate formally the complexity of an algorithm, for example, the difference between the optimal and the humanly optimal algorithms? Well, purely from computational point of view, we use either time or space, and we can then calculate the complexity of an algorithm. When it comes to the humanly optimal algorithm, it's a bit different. So when we want to study which algorithms are best suited for us, we also need to study those in terms of time or some other measure. But now we cannot have just a theoretical consideration. We need to go empirical. So we just need to gather data, how human beings solve certain problems, what kind of tools they use, and what kind of time this takes, what are the error rates. So we really need to do some experimentation in order to find out what the actual humanly optimal algorithms are and whether there indeed is one, the humanly optimal algorithm, or perhaps a few candidates which all are somehow more optimal than the computationally optimal algorithm. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening to me and giving me this chance to have the video conference. Such a shame I couldn't be there. Bye bye.